Hello, listeners, and thank you for tuning into this episode of the Giract Around the Coffee Table podcast. During this podcast series, we'll be diving deep into all of the trends and the very hottest topics shaping the ingredients industry. We'll be joined by guests who bring their own viewpoints on the biggest issues of the day, as well as Giract's in-house experts, that is to say, our own analysts, to bring you deep insights on the specific subject areas we're studying. In today's episode, I'm delighted to announce that I'm joined around the Giract coffee table by Eric Royer, one of Giract's research analysts, and Anesu Kuana, who manages Giract's events, programs, and publications. So welcome, both of you, and thank you for joining me today. I have to say, given that we all work in the same office, we're usually actually at different desks, and so it's really nice to be able to sit with you both around the same coffee table for a change. Many of our listeners will already know both of you actually from visits at trade shows and the Giract conferences, but many may not actually. So can I ask each of you to give a quick introduction to yourselves?
So I will be saying hello to all viewers. My name is Eric, and I am working at Giract as a research analyst on various functional ingredients. It's a bit protein, starches, and all different kind of processed food at the same time. So this is quite relevant for me to be here today.
Great, thanks, Eric.
Well, hello to all the listeners. I am Anis Kwana. As Graham mentioned, I'm the program manager, and within these programs, some of the most pertinent topics are discussed, such as ultra-processed foods and what exactly is trending and the different innovations. And it's just a pleasure to be able to join you today to discuss these from a different perspective, I would say. So thank you for having me.
No problem. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Anesu. So in today's podcast, we'll be discussing ultra-processed foods, or UPFs. Now, according to the European Commission data from 2022, it was indicated that nearly 60% of males and approximately 43% of females in the EU are actually overweight or obese. And in fact, across the pond, according to the NIH, approximately 73% of US adults are either overweight or obese. Now, obviously, the causes for this trend are widely debated. They're likely to be the product of myriad factors, but increasingly, it's the food we eat, or at least some of the foods we eat, that are indicated to be the culprit. And increasingly, UPFs seem to be vilified as one of the root causes of an enormous range of dietary-related disorders. Now, this probably isn't completely unfounded, actually. There's a growing body of evidence that suggests that UPFs may actually be a contributing factor. Now, in one study presented at the European Society of Cardiology in August 2023, which looked at a review of 10 other studies actually involving more than 325,000 men and women. This showed that those who ate the most ultra-processed food were 24% more likely to experience serious heart and circulatory events, including things like heart attacks, strokes, angina, for instance. Now, what it also indicated was that for each 10% rise in daily intake of ultra-processed food, you saw an approximate 6% increase in heart disease risk. So what are these UPFs, and do they genuinely deserve this reputation? I mean, in fact, the Collins English Dictionary definition of processed is to be treated or prepared by a special method, especially in order to preserve it. So how do we define these special methods? And what does it mean to be ultra-processed? Eric, you've been looking at this, haven't you?
Yes, so actually the definition of ultra-processed food isn't a very clear thing because it really depends on if we are looking from an official point of view or consumer perception. Because for a lot of consumer, ultra-processed food would be only, for example, fried food or food that are already rich in fat, sugar, like biscuits, or some very fat heavy bakery products, that kind of thing. But if we are looking at something official, we can see that there is a NOVA classification system that is applied to some of the products, and that try to give a better understanding of this processing side. For example, the products that would be in NOVA 1 would be the one that are minimally processed foods, such as fruits, vegetables, grains, that kind of thing. You have the NOVA 2, that would be more processed ingredients like oils, salt, sugars. So it means that it has been refined slightly from the raw material. NOVA 3 would be more advanced products like canned prepared vegetable, cheese, where there is multiple processing steps, and baked bread. And NOVA 4 would be what we call the ultra-processed food, or UPFs, which might contain additives, colorants, things that could improve the shelf life, or for textural improvement and synthetic flavor, encapsulated compounds, that kind of different things. And they go way beyond the traditional culinary processing, so way beyond what you could find in your grandma dish, basically. That's what we currently think. And one of the main points of UPFs would be that they are often related to industrial processing. So consumers think about factories when they are saying ultra-processed food, not about home cooking. And they are also thinking of products that, for example, there are these legends that you can keep them on a shelf for 10 years and they won't perish. That's the kind of products they are thinking when we say ultra-processed food. I would like to let my colleague Anisu speak on this topic, because I think he might also agree with this definition.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when you look at this ultra processed, it's very complicated because it's almost I've had these kinds of discussions with my colleague Eric that it's almost a chicken and egg situation of you kind of see how uh, before the idea of ultra processed was something with heavy chemical names, and then suddenly with the introduction of these fat loss drugs such as GLP-1, that's quite chemically heavy. That's a chemically heavy name, and in order to supplement that, you then need a chemical heavy substance in order to, kind of help you with this new diet. But at the same time, you don't want a chemical heavy name. So it's just the definitions are very much just they're quite out there, and I wouldn't say they're not that consistent in many spheres, I would say myself.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's interesting you raise the GLP-1 trend, because one of the things that really strikes me as odd is that the UFP trend and the GLP, or the rise of GLP-1 inhibitor drugs, seem to sort of run contrary almost, because on one side you've got consumers turning away from UPF, and then on the other side you've got consumers, often the same consumers actually, using these GLP-1 inhibitors. And also we're seeing a rise in these GLP-1 companion products. So these are products that are marketed to complement GLP-1 use. So these are products that are high protein, high fiber, nutrient and nutritionally dense, but also usually in a convenient format, for regular consumption. So almost by definition, they're a UPF, but they're viewed as very healthy products. And so I think it's odd that there is this sort of dichotomy there.
But I do agree, because it's true that actually ultra-processed food can be perfectly healthy. Because as we said earlier, a dish that is actually prepared from only cooked vegetable, if it is processed enough, can fall into the ultra-processed food category. And if we were looking at a different angle from a Nutri-Score side, maybe, you could very well have a product that has an overclassification of 4, and at the same time get a Nutri-Score of A, meaning that it's actually, once again, a Nutri-Score can also be debated, but it would mean that it would still be an interesting product that can be rich in proteins, vitamins, and balanced for a healthy diet.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'm a millennial myself, and when I was doing food technology at school, this was back in the 1990s. So this was at high school in the United Kingdom. We always had the assignment of trying to design essentially a healthy ready meal. So perhaps we weren't, because it was at school, we weren't really utilizing the same sort of industrial scale processing that a lot of food manufacturers do have access to. But nevertheless, the purpose was to design a convenient ready meal that was nutritionally well balanced and fairly healthy. But we would have been using a lot of ingredients that by today's standards would have been considered processed or even ultra processed, actually, in some cases. And so I actually think it's strange now that there's this entire generation of millennials, perhaps not all of whom studied food technology at school, but many of whom would have done and would have gone through this process of carefully designing, as I say, nutritionally balanced ready meals, yet still go to the supermarket and turn away from these ready meals, considering them UPFs. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that is this really, are these new products? Are UPFs new products? Is this a new trend, or is this actually something that's been around for a long time?
You are actually quite right, because the concept of ready meal or food processing has been going on for a long time. So it's difficult to assess it properly, but we could say that it's from before the. I would probably say that it started from the 90s, because since a long time ago we actually had something like food canning, mainly for a shelf life purpose, keeping your food ready for a long time. So these steps could actually make your product fall into the Nova classification, and they make sense saying that it's processed, because it also means that you are probably adding some kind of sweeteners or phosphates, ingredients that have this purpose and that actually make your food ultra processed. But the awareness of the consumer is something that is much more recent, and just like you said earlier, it has been linked with obesity and disease that some consumers are experiencing, even if the main driver isn't the fact that they are ultra processed, but more like the consumption habits and indeed nutrients that the people take in a day.
Yeah, I see. I see. I mean, maybe one of the really big things that's happened since, you were describing about canning, for instance, in the past as a preservation method. I mean, one of the really big things since then, obviously, is the internet and now social media. I mean, a lot of the conversation around UPFs is actually on social media, and it's from social media influencers. So, is the conversation really controlled by social media influencers now?
Um, that's a very good question. I mean, one thing that I mean, personally, I've noticed as well is within the social media landscape, I would say, especially during COVID, there was this huge trend of um, people preparing meals, people people preparing healthy meals, traditional meals. This is kind of them really pushing against the quote unquote UPF package. This is, as Eric mentioned, ingredients that you would usually see in your grandmother's pantry. This is they really pushed that, and that because most people were locked in their homes, just consuming this social media on and on. This kind of continued after because people wanted to continue making quote unquote healthy meals. And to an extent, this kind of then pushed, of course, social media influencers work with brands. So brands some caught onto this and then started, obviously, supplying these influencers with what they deemed as healthy, and these influencers, whether they knew it or not, were probably marketing these. Potentially they were ultra processed, potentially they weren't, but the point is they were really driving home this healthy lifestyle. And so I'd say they have an influence, but since the end of the pandemic, I would say it's still very much with following that kind of influencer mindset, because um, chefs and all these kinds of influencers are very much still a huge market, especially for those within the food industry. But I will say what also came with I don't know if everyone feels the same, but what came with the pandemic was a lot of skepticism to anyone that just has a voice. So this kind
Right.
of then added to some people maybe feeling as though they started reading their own labels, and this just added to more of the confusion of what's ultra processed, what's healthy, what's
Right.
not, what is healthy. So it just depends also which influencers you're following and
Right. Yeah.
maybe what their message might be, you know.
Yeah, but nevertheless, I mean, most of the conversation around UPFs online on social media is generally negative, isn't it? Do you think that food manufacturers are sort of losing the battle, so to speak, and do they need to do more to kind of maybe recapture the narrative?
So that's a really good question. I think I wouldn't say they uh, I think you quite rightly said losing the battle. They haven't lost it. They can take control because human natures. These influences can be themselves influenced by the industry themselves. Um, so maybe instead of having to really educate the entire um, consumer society, which is difficult, maybe keying into the key influences and then kind of educating them, also giving them incentives to actually advertise or really circulate your product. Potentially, they could really get involved with those influencers and educating them, letting them know this, yes, ultra processed means this, but this are the health benefits. This is what this means. And then tying into this whole GLP-1 craze and everything, it really, they can get involved in this. Doing it on their own, I think, is where they may lose the battle. If they
Right.
really just try to do it on their own and try to educate everyone, I think it has to be very targeted battles, I would say.
Right, okay. One of the other things that strikes me actually about UPFs is plant-based meats analogues, plant-based seafood, etc. I mean, generally this category will use texturization ingredients. They normally include things like methyl cellulose, for example. They often have emulsifiers. They've got the exact sort of ingredients that a lot of consumers would avoid in a sort of, I suppose, as a UPF or as an ultra processed ingredient. Nevertheless, it's almost like consumers accept these ingredients in a plant-based analog, for instance, if they accept that it has a functional role to play, if it delivers the texture of a plant-based meat. Um, it's almost like the consumers would accept the ingredients in some applications and not others. Do you think that's fair?
I do think it makes sense if we look at all the trends regarding healthy food and new plant-based alternatives, because the consumer are also trying to move on from the old ways of consumption. So it's true that if you look at the precise composition of the products and you see the E numbers or the ingredients that you wouldn't accept in other products, you can show some fear or think about it twice, but at the same time, there is a lack of options regarding the plant-based alternatives that don't use these ingredients. They do exist because, for example, if you look at the meat alternatives, you can find a few ones that don't include, for example, chemically modified starches or emulsifiers, processed ones at least. But usually these products also have texture that isn't as close as one you could get by using these ingredients. I think that's one of the reasons, because some people want meat alternative, but they want it to have the texture of meat. Actually, both of the two different kinds of products are being sold, so there is a part of the population that doesn't want these ingredients, even in alternatives, just like you were mentioning.
Right. Do you think we're underestimating Gen Z and Generation Alpha, actually, in the sense that these are really the first generations that are growing up in a totally in a social media era, but with a very heightened awareness of fake news. And I just wonder, actually, if Gen Z, but particularly Generation Alpha, will be the first generation that just sort of question everything and are happy to sort of look up unfamiliar ingredients. And once they identify maybe that just because it's got an E, in fact, not only just because it's got an E number, it's not unhealthy, but in fact, as it's got an E number, it's been tested and certified as not bad for you. They may actually be more accepting. This could actually be the first generation of or the first demographic that actually accepts unfamiliar sounding or scientific sounding ingredients, providing they understand they serve a function. I guess only time will tell, and we'll have to watch this space, so to speak. But I do wonder if, as I say, if Gen Alpha will sort of look at millennials and Gen X as the almost sort of the Luddites of the food consumer industry.
But I do think
obviously,
sorry, I do
yeah,
think
go
it's
ahead.
I do think it's a complicated topic, because one of the issue currently is that a lot of the industry or that processed food, they are trying to not be transparent about their ingredients. So they are often using some legislation tricks to hide the name of the ingredients that is in use, or to introduce it with in another way. Like, for example, we can mention natural flavor, in which you can actually include a lot of different things. And but with more transparency, if consumers are aware of what they are eating, it could make sense that they can accept it more easily if they get enough input for confirmation that this is healthy for them. Because just like you mentioned, also with social medias and a lot of information that is going around, it's hard to get your own judgment and be sure that, for example, any number is healthy, unless you are from the industry.
Yeah. This is a debate that's not going to go away. It's gonna run and run, and I imagine it will just become more heavily nuanced as time goes by. In fact, we'll have to leave it there for today's episode, but we will be exploring this much more in next month's episode, where we'll be looking at UPFs in a historical context and whether, in fact, we're just rebranding the food we've always used to eat. So I want to thank you both for joining me around the Giract coffee table today. As always, it's been thoroughly enjoyable. So do tune in for that April episode, which will be available on Spotify and YouTube at the end of April. Until then, goodbye.